In this lecture, I'll provide a brief summary of what we've covered so far in our first 2 weeks of class, and then set up what our focus will be for our last week of class. So in terms of where we've been, just a brief summary of what we've covered so far with respect to team performance and team effectiveness. So first and foremost, we spent some time in the first week thinking about team launch and team design and focusing on the features of team design, which the two major buckets there are composition and structure. And with respect to composition, we discussed the people on the team and a variety of perspectives to think about who to staff a team with, and thinking about things like technical skills, but also balancing that with interpersonal skills, people having those sort of collaboration readiness capabilities. To think a little bit more about the idea of diversity and sources and types of diversity, along with configurations of diversity, and including subgroups and fault lines. So situations where characteristics line up in a team of different qualities on the team. And then also these kinds of interpersonal concepts like familiarity or prior shared experience, where we know that when people have a history together, that can form the basis for trust and other readiness in terms of collaborating and sharing knowledge and understanding one another. In addition to composition, we understand that to launch a team successfully, we should put structures in place, and talked extensively about goals and the qualities of effective goals for teams, the need to have roles and accountability identified, understanding the role that interdependence plays, and thinking about how to connect people with outcome interdependence. Having some shared reward or compensation can elicit more collaboration in a team, and effective norms, so expectations of behavior in teams. So those are all elements of team design to set up and launch a team effectively. Then we last week got into the idea of processes, which are interactive behaviors that take place in teams. And there are many different kinds of processes, but things that we covered were the need for effective communication patterns in teams, the need for information and knowledge sharing, but in particular emphasizing how to get unique knowledge shared and leveraged in a team, and resisting the common information effect. Considering the idea of learning behaviors, trying to get teams to be effective at cycles of process improvement, and understanding how feedback and after action review and reflexivity are ways that teams can improve performance over time. Thinking about creative processes like brainstorming as well to support team learning and innovation, and understanding conflict and different kinds of conflict resolution approaches that can help gain the benefits from task conflict and avoid relationship conflict. And finally, to think about decision-making processes, methods, and rules that can all make sure teams avoid things like groupthink and avoid ineffective decisions, inability to converge and make choices. And then lastly, we spent some time thinking about these psychological states that are important to team effectiveness, including cohesion, so the sense that the team feels like a unit, an entity, people feel an affective commitment to the team. Psychological safety and trust, so trust, and both of these are kind of cognitive ideas that we rely on each other and that people are reliable, but also psychological safety is the sense that it's safe to take risks, it's safe to admit errors, it's safe to explore and have failure and learn from that in the team, which we'll come back to just a little bit this week as well. And then these shared cognitive structures like shared mental models to recognize that teams actually have a common understanding of their purpose and their vision and how they should work together, and transactive memory systems, which has to do with teams knowing who knows what and being able to specialize and leverage unique knowledge in the team. So that's sort of a quick overview of what we've learned and understood so far about supporting teamwork and team effectiveness in our organizations. So that seems like a lot, but honestly, that's a little bit of a head fake. We have Lucy pulling the ball from Charlie Brown here, and that's not the end of the story. In fact, there is a lot more to the story about what makes the most effective teams and the most effective team-based organizations. And a lot of that has to do with the external context and external dynamics. So if we think about, the traditional model, one way you can think about this is the grippy model: goals, roles, processes, interpersonal relationships. That's a little bit of what we just reviewed, a kind of short, concise summary. But, this image says it's no longer enough. I'm not sure it ever was enough. But in today's competitive environment, in today's world of ever more specialized training and knowledge and ever more dynamic environments, we have now organizations that are much faster cycled organizations, much more dynamic. We have organizations that are flatter, that have less formal authority in them. So the need for power and influence, and those are undefined and often negotiated in organizations today. Work structures are flatter with shifting interdependencies. I think we can think about all of these things when we cover the Disney case this week. And knowledge structures, distributed but changing fast, moving with organizational redesign, with moving things offshore, where knowledge is located, what needs to be leveraged, who can access it is more dynamic than ever. And what this ends up setting up is a need to manage external dynamics. So our last week of class is going to tap into what this means exactly. What are external dynamics? So the things we're going to cover between the lectures and our case and exercises this week are going to cover these topics. We're going to talk about teaming across boundaries. So we'll think about the idea that everything up to this week you can really think of as inside the team boundary. So from the members only, what needs to happen to make those teams most effective. But in reality, as we've mentioned before, teams are situated in an organization, and teams rely on people and units and resources from outside of their boundary. They are producing things for stakeholders or customers outside their boundary. And so to really be effective, there has to be relationships being managed across those boundaries. So we'll start out thinking about what is external learning. We talked about those internal learning behaviors, but teams need to learn from outside to be effective. We will discuss the concept of X teams to think about what principles X teams can bring to bear and how can we as managers inject these X team principles to make our teams more effective. And as a part of that, we'll think about external roles. So we certainly have to think about roles and accountability inside the team, but there's specific activities and roles that need to be played for boundary spanning and for external activities in teams. So we'll discuss some of those roles as were presented in the textbook to think a little bit about, how do you think about managing those? When are those going to be most crucial in a team's lifespan? We'll spend some time thinking about collaboration barriers. The textbook talked a little bit about the idea of not invented here, how internal and external knowledge is weighed as whether it's beneficial or not. So we'll spend a little time thinking about what gets in the way of collaboration, both in teams but also in organizations, which leads us up to the topic of multi-team systems and team-based organizations. So we started with that a bit with CNS wholesale grocers, but that was more solving operational problems and not thinking about redesigning top to bottom as a team-based organization, for instance, for innovation, like we'll see in the Disney case. And we'll talk about when would you do that, what the purpose of that is. But really, I think even more importantly, we'll talk about the implications and challenges for teams, teaming, teamwork, and the people who work in those teams with some consideration of multi-team systems. So organizations that are built with multiple teams that have to interact interdependently to get work done. And one key implication of that is multi-team membership, where most of us have this experience. We're on more than one team. So what are the implications for team effectiveness, and what are the implications for workers themselves? And then finally, with an open systems view of teams, we also know that teams operate in multiple contexts, and things like cultural distance, geographic distance, and virtuality and language differences all come to play. Culture is a bigger topic than we're going to cover here. I have a course on cross-cultural management. It's Management 6310. I teach it in the J term. I really encourage you, if you haven't taken this class, to consider it. That's a very, very deep dive into culture and the effects of cultural differences on work. We'll touch that briefly, but I'm going to spend some emphasis time on Friday afternoon thinking about distance and virtual work and work with linguistically different teams. People have language differences in teams. So that's the sum total of what we'll be thinking about under this final topic of external dynamics.